Finding Bigfoot ran for 11 seasons on Animal Planet and became one of the most watched wildlife-adjacent documentary series in cable television history without ever producing the single piece of evidence whose discovery its title promised. That contradiction, a show called Finding Bigfoot, that across 122 broadcast episodes never found Bigfoot, has been the central tension of the franchise's public reception since its premiere in 2011, generating equal measures of devoted audience engagement and skeptical dismissal from critics who treated the show's consistent failure to produce definitive proof as evidence that the subject was not worth taking seriously. What that dismissal missed, what the show's most attentive viewers understood across its run without the institutional framework to fully articulate, is that the contradiction was not accidental. Finding Bigfoot was not a show about finding Bigfoot. It was a show about the experience of looking for something whose existence the evidence strongly suggested, but whose definitive documentation remained perpetually one investigation beyond the show's reach. The team, Matt Moneymaker, Ranae Holland, Cliff Barackman, and James Bobo Fay, were not performers playing investigators. They were genuinely experienced field researchers whose collective knowledge of the evidence base for Bigfoot's existence was more extensive than any comparable group the paranormal television format had assembled in a single production. Matt Moneymaker had founded the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization and spent decades systematically documenting encounter reports across the full geographic range of the phenomenon. Cliff Barackman's track-casting expertise and his methodical approach to physical evidence analysis represented a standard of forensic rigor that the broader Bigfoot research community had rarely achieved. Ranae Holland's professional background as a field biologist gave the team a scientific skepticism that was genuine rather than performed, a willingness to apply conventional biological analysis to the evidence, and to say plainly when that analysis produced a conventional explanation. And Bobo Fay's physical presence in the field, his size, his woodsmanship, and his instinctive understanding of the terrain the investigations operated in, gave the team a capability in the deep forest that no studio-bound production could replicate. That team, operating across 11 seasons of field investigation in some of the most remote and most evidentially active wilderness in North America, produced 122 broadcast episodes, and then they filmed one more. That one is the episode that was just released. And the reason it was hidden while the others aired is the reason this video exists. The broadcast history of Finding Bigfoot is more evidentially significant than the show's critics have ever acknowledged, and more significant than the show's own format was designed to communicate. The episode structure, witness interviews, night investigations, wood-knocking sessions, call blasting, thermal camera deployments in active areas, was calibrated for television entertainment rather than scientific documentation, and the production decisions that shaped each episode prioritized dramatic presentation over evidentiary precision in ways that the team's most serious members were visibly uncomfortable with across multiple seasons. But underneath the entertainment format, the investigation record the broadcast seasons accumulated was genuinely substantive. The thermal hits logged across multiple investigation sessions in specific geographic areas, whose consistency indicated resident rather than transient activity. The acoustic responses to call blasting that the team documented at distances and with a speed that ruled out human production. The track evidence that Cliff Barackman documented at specific sites whose dermal ridge characteristics and anatomical proportions he analyzed on camera with the careful precision of a researcher whose professional credibility was on the line with every assessment he made. The tree structures and branch manipulations found at investigation sites in the Pacific Northwest, the Southeast, and the Great Lakes region whose construction characteristics Bobo assessed with the practical knowledge of a man whose physical dimensions gave him a uniquely calibrated sense of what human capability could and could not produce in the field. Ranae Holland's role in the broadcast record is the most significant and the most underappreciated element of what the seasons built. She was never a true believer. Her scientific training and her professional skepticism were genuine, and they were applied consistently. She said no when the evidence did not meet her standard, and she said yes when it did. And the yeses she produced across 11 seasons carry a weight that no committed believer's affirmation could match. The specific investigations where Ranae's skeptical framework produced genuine uncertainty rather than dismissal. The sessions where her on-camera response to the evidence was not the professional shake of the head that the audience came to recognize as her default, but something more unsettled and more specifically uncomfortable, are the investigations that map most directly onto the content of the banned episode. She had been getting close to something across the final seasons. The banned episode is where she arrived. The investigation that produced the banned episode was conducted in a section of the Pacific Northwest, whose specific location the production team has not publicly identified in the communications that have accompanied the episode's release. What has been disclosed is the category of location, a remote, old-growth forest drainage system in a geographic area that the Finding Bigfoot research team's prior fieldwork had identified as the single most evidentially dense location in their investigation history. The evidence density at this location was not the product of a single investigation season's findings. It was the accumulation of independent encounter reports, physical evidence recoveries, and acoustic documentation from multiple independent sources across a period of years that preceded the Finding Bigfoot investigation by more than a decade. Matt Moneymaker's BFRO database contained a concentration of reports from this drainage system, whose geographic clustering and whose behavioral consistency across independent accounts separated by years of time indicated a resident population operating within a defined territorial range, rather than occasional individual transits through the area. Cliff Barackman had visited the location independently prior to the team's investigation deployment and had documented track evidence whose anatomical characteristics he assessed as among the most significant physical evidence he had encountered in his research career. The specific combination of factors that made the location significant: the old-growth forest canopy whose density provided the cover conditions that the behavioral evidence consistently associated with high-activity zones, the water sources that the encounter distribution was clustered around, the elevation and the aspect of the drainage whose combination produced the specific microclimate conditions that the prior physical evidence suggested were preferred, was as close to a guaranteed active zone as the team's collective field experience had identified in 11 seasons of investigation. When Animal Planet agreed to fund a full investigation deployment at this location, the team's internal communications reflected an awareness that this was different from the standard Finding Bigfoot episode deployment. Not different in its format. The witness interviews, the night investigations, the thermal deployments were all planned in the standard production framework, different in the quality of what everyone involved expected the investigation to produce. The location had been producing extraordinary evidence for years without a full systematic investigation. The team was the most experienced group of Bigfoot field researchers in the country. The conditions were optimal. Something was going to happen. What happened was not what anyone had prepared for. The Finding Bigfoot episode format always began with a town hall, a community meeting where local witnesses described their encounters. The team assessed the credibility of the accounts, and the investigation was oriented toward the areas and the behaviors the witness testimony indicated. The town hall for the banned episode investigation produced witness accounts that the production's standard format was designed to receive and that the team processed with the professional efficiency 11 seasons of practice had built into their collective methodology. What the town hall did not produce, what the production would not discover until the investigation was already underway, was the full picture of what the local community knew about this specific drainage system and what their relationship to it had been across the years of accumulated encounter activity that the BFRO database had only partially captured. The witnesses who attended the town hall told the team what they had seen. What they did not tell the team, what emerged only in the private conversations that Ranae Holland conducted with several community members after the formal town hall had concluded and the production cameras had been packed, was the extent to which the local population had developed a practiced relationship with whatever was operating in the drainage. Not a fearful relationship, not the unsettled, reluctant acknowledgement of something inexplicable that the town hall format typically produced. A relationship whose character Ranae described in her field notes from that evening as closer to the relationship an indigenous community maintains with a significant feature of its local landscape than to the reaction of a modern rural community to occasional anomalous wildlife encounters. The community knew the drainage, they knew its rhythms, they knew which times of year the activity was highest, which sections of the system produced the most consistent evidence, and which behavioral patterns indicated that whatever was operating there was settled and established rather than disturbed by human proximity. And several of them, the ones whose families had the longest connection to the area, knew something specific about the drainage that the BFRO database had not captured because none of them had ever submitted it to a formal reporting system. They knew that the drainage had a center, a specific location within it where the evidence was not distributed across a territorial range but concentrated, where the physical evidence, the acoustic activity, and the encounter frequency all pointed toward a single area as the focal point of whatever was operating in the system. That location is where Bobo insisted the investigation needed to go on the second night, and that is where the cameras were when the banned episode's footage was captured. The second night investigation at the focal point the community witnesses had identified produced the footage that the banned episode contains and that Animal Planet reviewed and removed from the broadcast pipeline before any episode was assembled. The thermal camera deployment at the focal point location was the most comprehensive the Finding Bigfoot production had mounted in any prior investigation. Multiple units covering overlapping fields of view whose combined coverage eliminated the single camera artifact explanations that could be applied to anomalous footage from isolated units. Cliff Barackman had positioned the cameras with the methodical spatial logic that his track analysis background had trained him to apply, covering the approach corridors that the physical evidence at the site indicated as primary movement routes, with overlapping coverage at the central area itself that would document whatever moved through it from multiple simultaneous angles. The call blasting session that preceded the thermal deployment had produced acoustic responses that Matt Moneymaker's field experience identified as coming from multiple independent sources at distances and from directions consistent with a population rather than a single individual, responses whose structure and whose spatial distribution across the drainage he documented in real time with the specific quality of controlled excitement that his 11 seasons of similar sessions had never quite produced before. The thermal cameras began logging anomalous signatures within the first 40 minutes of the night session. What distinguished the signatures from the range of thermal anomalies the team had documented across the prior seasons was not their size. Though the dimensions of the primary signature were at the upper boundary of the size range the team's investigation history had established, it was their number and their organization. 3 independent signatures visible simultaneously across the overlapping camera coverage, moving in a coordinated pattern whose spatial organization Bobo assessed in real time as consistent with the kind of deliberate positioning that his practical field experience had never previously encountered in any wildlife species he had knowledge of. They were not moving through the area. They were working it systematically, with a spatial awareness of each other's positions and a coordination of their individual movements that indicated a level of cooperative behavior whose cognitive requirements Ranae's biological framework found impossible to account for in any known North American species. Then the primary signature moved toward the camera position, not toward the team's position, toward the camera, as though it had identified the thermal unit as distinct from the investigators monitoring it and had decided to approach it specifically. What the camera documented when the primary signature closed to close range is the footage that produced the suppression decision, and it is footage that every person who has reviewed it has described with a consistency that communicates something specific about its character. Not frightening, not dramatic in the way paranormal footage is typically dramatic, but deeply and quietly final, like something that answers a question so completely that the act of watching it makes the prior uncertainty feel, in retrospect, like a form of protection that the footage permanently removes. The Finding Bigfoot investigation at the drainage focal point did not end because the production schedule was complete or because the team had achieved the documentation objectives the deployment was designed to pursue. It ended because of what happened in the 45 minutes following the primary thermal signature's approach to the camera position, a sequence of events that the cameras documented continuously and that the team experienced directly in a way that the prior 11 seasons of investigation had not produced in any of them. What occurred during those 45 minutes has been described by the team members in the limited private accounts that have circulated among people close to the production since the investigation was conducted. The descriptions are consistent across the independent accounts and consistent in the specific quality of what they communicate about the nature of the experience, not a dramatic confrontation, not a physical encounter in the sense of direct contact, but a sustained proximity event whose character the team's combined field experience was not adequate to process within the investigative framework they had been operating in for 11 seasons. Something was present at that location for 45 minutes in a way that everyone present understood as chosen, rather than incidental. It was there because it had decided to be there. It remained for the duration it chose to remain, and it departed with the same deliberateness with which it had arrived, not fleeing, not disturbed, but concluding something that it had apparently decided was worth concluding. Ranae Holland's field notes from that night are the most significant document in the entire Finding Bigfoot investigation record. They have not been publicly released. What has been referenced in accounts of their content is that they contain Ranae's written assessment of the 45-minute sequence, an assessment produced in the field immediately following the event by a professional field biologist whose scientific framework was applied to every prior Finding Bigfoot investigation with consistent rigor, and that the assessment does not contain the language of uncertainty or ambiguity that Ranae's prior field documentation consistently produced when the evidence she was encountering fell short of her evidentiary standard. The notes are written in the language of conclusion. The investigation ended the following morning. The equipment was packed without the standard post-investigation documentation session. The team left the drainage without the debrief that 11 seasons of operational practice had established as standard procedure. And nobody talked about what had happened. Not to the production, not to Animal Planet, not to the research community, and not publicly, until the banned episode's release made the silence unsustainable. The footage from the Finding Bigfoot banned episode investigation was reviewed by Animal Planet within the standard post-production timeline following the session's conclusion. What distinguished the subsequent process from every prior episode's post-production workflow was the specific point in the review chain at which the footage's escalation to the network's executive level occurred, and the specific nature of the response that escalation produced. The production editor who conducted the initial raw footage review had worked on the Finding Bigfoot production across multiple seasons. They had reviewed footage from every category of anomalous evidence the show had produced: the thermal hits, the acoustic responses, the physical evidence documentation, and the night investigation sessions whose most dramatic moments had been shaped into broadcast entertainment across 11 seasons of episodes. What they encountered in the raw footage from the drainage investigation was something they had not previously encountered in any prior season's material, and their response to it was not to flag it for the standard editorial process that shaped anomalous footage into broadcast content. It was to stop the review and escalate immediately. Animal Planet's response to the escalation followed a pattern whose specific characteristics are inconsistent with a network making a purely internal editorial decision about difficult content. The decision was made at an organizational level above the standard production executive chain. It was made within a time frame that the normal deliberative processes of an organization that size do not permit for content decisions requiring careful evaluation, and it was communicated back to the production not as an editorial judgment about specific footage, but as an instruction, comprehensive, non-negotiable, and accompanied by the specific additional instruction that the investigation had not taken place, and that no reference to it was to appear in any subsequent production communication. That instruction is the most revealing element of Animal Planet's response. Networks that pull episodes for ordinary editorial reasons acknowledge the episode's existence while declining to broadcast them. The instruction to treat the investigation as non-existent was not an editorial decision, it was a suppression decision. And the specificity of it, the totality of the erasure it demanded, applied to footage from a show whose prior 122 episodes had never produced a comparable response, communicates something about the character of what the drainage footage contained that is as significant as any description of the footage itself. Finding Bigfoot spent 11 seasons looking. The banned episode is what the looking found. Animal Planet did not suppress this footage because it contained more ambiguous evidence. They suppressed it because the thermal cameras documented something at close range for 45 minutes that chose to be there, stayed for the duration it chose to stay, and departed when it was finished. That is not ambiguous evidence. That is confirmation. The broadcast record of 122 episodes was the search. The banned episode is the arrival. Ranae Holland's field notes from that night are written in the language of scientific conclusion rather than investigative hypothesis. That is the most significant sentence in this entire video. The most demanding scientific skeptic on the most watched Bigfoot investigation show in television history wrote in the language of conclusion. The footage that produced those notes has been in a production archive for years. It is now in the world. What it shows has been in those forests the entire time. The search is over. What comes next is something else entirely.